Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? I originally didn't want to shoot this video, but I feel compelled to at this point. It's kind of gone on long enough. You see, about a month ago as I'm filming this, Sony Computer Entertainment did its annual earnings report and kind of shareholder conference call, where they talk about where all the money came from and went to during the previous fiscal year, and then how things are looking for the next year. And there was one little bit in that conference call that kind of caught the gaming news sites by surprise and spawned headlines like this, basically declaring that Sony called the PlayStation Vita a legacy product, and then going on to kind of assume that the Vita is getting discontinued. I don't think that's the case at all, so in this video I want to lay out my reasons why I think these news sites are wrong, and then a bit of a warning to those who frequently read these types of sites. So first, of course, is what sparked all of this? Well, it was a quote, and let me actually read you the quote by Andrew House, verbatim, what he said during that earnings call. "We had an increase in some fixed expenses, notably around our network platform, and as you're all aware, we took a write-off towards some components of our legacy platforms." Now, as he said that, there were slides on screen about the PlayStation Vita and the PlayStation TV as being selling less than what they expected. And the PlayStation 3 was also selling less than they expected in the previous year. And that quote about writing off components and legacy systems is what sparked the whole Vita thing. They assumed in these reports that the Vita itself was being written off, that the components listed, on the slide and what they were talking about in the quote were actual Vita and PlayStation TV systems. And that's not necessarily all that hard to imagine, considering that Vita and PlayStation TV sales haven't been that great. And they admitted that as much in that conference call. But here's the thing. Components don't mean systems when it comes to business talk. They mean components, parts. Sony is a manufacturer. They don't just do software, they do hardware. And what ultimately a lot of Sony PR people reached out to news sites like VentureBeat and many others that ran stories like this was to explain that what the whole write-off was about were components left over from when they manufactured the original PlayStation Vita, the Model 1000. They stopped making that model, they started making the 2000, the new slim one. They had extra parts left over. They're not useful for anything else, so what is Sony supposed to do with them? Well, any business is going to want to get them off of their books. So they recycled them and wrote them off. And that's exactly what this quote refers to. They wrote off those parts from the original Vita systems that they no longer needed. Now, of course, Vita sales haven't been as good, and they said as much in that quote. But another reason why I don't think the Vita itself is getting discontinued is that later on in that same presentation, Andrew House also said that Vita sales remain strong in the Asia and Japanese regions. Why would Sony want to kill an entire product line if it's still doing well in certain places? Also, one other thing is that Sony has traditionally been very open when it comes to discussing the end dates for its products. The most recent product that got discontinued and end of life was the PlayStation Portable. And Sony was very upfront, several months in advance, saying, look, at this date is when we're going to stop sales of the PlayStation Portable. They didn't surprise anyone with it. They didn't use weasel words. They didn't hide it. They just said, look, this is when it's done. And they do that for a couple of reasons. One, because I don't think they want to catch anyone by surprise. And two, because they want to warn their developers. Sony can't just do everything itself. It relies on its developers in order to keep that ecosystem going, all the third-party developers like Square Enix. And if they were to just suddenly say, oh, we're just killing this as of today, if any of those developers have products already in development, they're going to be pissed, because chances are they're not going to sell as many units of a game if the system's been discontinued than if it's still in production. The reason why this story that is really a non-story got as big as it is because of the way that news propagates on the internet now. Back in the day when physical newspapers were really the primary source of information, all the journalists and reporters had to do independent research on their own. They couldn't copy each other so much because they all published at the same time, namely the next morning when all the newspapers were getting distributed. With the internet, you've got this constant cycle of publication. You can write a story, click a button, and it's on the internet instantly. So what we see are a lot of publications like VentureBeat, GameSpot, and a number of others watching each other's work, where if a news story pops up on a competitor that they hadn't heard of, that still gives them a jump. They can quickly read that story, basically reformulate it in their own words, and then republish it. The problem is when they do that, they don't necessarily do a lot of individual, independent research on their own when they're writing their version of the story. They'll just trust the original author of that story to have done proper homework and be correct, and all they're really doing is rewriting, and that's just because of the breakneck pace that this sort of journalism entails. If you've got one that didn't necessarily do their homework or went a little bit off the deep end with the assumptions, then all the other ones are going to follow because they're under time crunches as well. I think there's been too much of a blurring of gossip and journalism when it comes to articles like this. So all my advice is for you, when you see articles like this, don't necessarily take them at face value. Read a little bit deeper. And if you want, a lot of times they also cite their sources. In my case, I went and found that source and listened to that entire earnings report. And that's where I got that quote. And that was the same quote that they used, but they only used a small part of it to make a story out of it. There really is no story. So do your own homework if something doesn't quite smell right, like with these sorts of headlines. Remember, they're designed to try and drive views, which is advertising dollars, which keeps them going. They only make money if you read the articles, as opposed to traditional newspapers where you've paid your money for that newspaper, now you have it and can read the articles. The newspaper doesn't make any more money by doing sensational titles on stories or trying to spin things. They've already got your money, they might as well be honest. With blog sites and news sites, you gotta be a bit more careful. So, if you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. If you haven't already, do subscribe, would you? It helps me out quite a bit. And as always, thank you all so much for watching.